Picture this. You're walking down Dorset Street in London's Whitechapel district. On a fog-thick evening in 1888, gas lamps flicker weakly through the yellow haze, casting dancing shadows on crumbling brick walls. Your boots squelch through mud mixed with things you don't want to identify. From a narrow alleyway comes the sound of a woman's desperate sobbing, cut short by a man's harsh voice barking orders. A door slams. Silence returns, save for the distant clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone and the ever-present drip of condensation from rusted iron pipes above. You pause, instinctively knowing you've stumbled into one of London's most notorious rookeries, a maze of overcrowded tenements, gin shops and establishments that decent Victorian society pretended didn't exist. Through a grimy window you catch a glimpse of red velvet curtains, a woman's pale face pressed against the glass for just a moment before disappearing back into shadows. The acrid smell of coal smoke mingles with something else, desperation perhaps, or simply human misery concentrated into these few square blocks where survival trumped morality every single night. This is where our story begins, not in the grand drawing rooms of Mayfair or the pristine parlours celebrated in Victorian novels, but in the hidden underbelly that made such respectability possible. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Mary Kelly had been beautiful once. At 25, traces of her former loveliness still flickered across her face when she smiled, which happened rarely in the autumn of 1888 AD. Born in Ireland, she'd arrived in London with dreams common to thousands of young women: domestic service in a respectable household, perhaps marriage to a tradesman, children, a small but clean home. Instead, she found herself trapped in a single room at 13 Miller's Court, earning her living in ways that would have horrified the girl who'd stepped off the boat from County Limerick just a few years earlier. Mary's story wasn't unique. Across Victorian Britain, thousands of women found themselves working in brothels, some grand establishments in fashionable districts, others little more than hovels in the slums. What united them wasn't moral failing, as contemporary society insisted, but economic desperation in an age when women had virtually no legal rights and fewer opportunities for legitimate employment. Dr. William Acton, a prominent Victorian physician who studied prostitution extensively, estimated in his 1857 AD report that London alone housed between 80,000 and 120,000 prostitutes. His clinical language couldn't mask the human tragedy behind those numbers. The great bulk of prostitutes in this country are in all probability daughters of tradesmen of the lower class, domestic servants, and women who have been employed in various kinds of manual labor. But Acton's statistics, shocking as they were to his middle-class readers, barely scratched the surface of a system built on exploitation and maintained by willful blindness. Catherine Kate Eddowes knew the weight of empty pockets and the gnawing ache of hunger. Born in 1842 AD in Graiseley Heath, Wolverhampton, she'd worked as a tin plate stamper before economic hardship drove her to London's East End. By 1888 AD, she was living in common lodging houses, scraping together fourpence for a bed when she could, sleeping rough when she couldn't. On September 29, 1888 AD, she was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, not unusual for women in her circumstances, who often turned to gin to dull the sharp edges of poverty and despair. Released from Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 a.m. on September 30th, Kate had fourpence in her pocket, enough for a bed, but she needed money for food. She headed toward the narrow streets where women like her could earn a few coins, unaware that this decision would make her name infamous in criminal history as one of Jack the Ripper's victims. Kate's final hours illuminate the precarious existence of women who drifted between casual prostitution and other forms of survival. These weren't women working in established brothels with fixed addresses and regular clientele. They were part of a vast underclass of casual laborers, street sellers, and occasional sex workers who populated the lodging houses and common kitchens of London's poorest districts. The distinction mattered enormously in terms of safety, income, and social status. Women working in established brothels, while still vulnerable to violence and disease, at least had shelter and some protection from madams who had financial incentives to keep their workers alive and functional. Women like Kate Eddowes, working the streets independently, faced dangers that respectable Victorian society preferred to ignore completely. Hannah Culwick, a domestic servant who kept detailed diaries throughout the Victorian era, provides rare insight into the economic pressures that drove women toward prostitution. Born in 1833 AD, Hannah worked as a maid-of-all-work, scrubbing floors, carrying coal, and performing the back-breaking labor that kept middle-class households functioning. Her wages rarely exceeded £12 per year, barely enough for food and clothing, with nothing left for savings or emergencies. "Got up at 5 this morning," Hannah wrote in her diary entry for May 15th, 1860 AD. "Lit the fires, cleaned the grates, scrubbed the front steps, and prepared breakfast before the family woke. My hands are so raw they've started bleeding again, but I daren't complain for fear of losing my place." Margaret, who worked at the house before me, went on the streets after she fell ill and couldn't work. "I pray daily that won't be my fate, but I wonder sometimes what choice any of us really have." Hannah's fears were well-founded. Victorian society offered working-class women a narrow range of employment options: domestic service, factory work, piecework like sewing or laundry, or selling goods on the street. All paid wages so low that a single missed week of work due to illness could mean homelessness. Marriage offered some security, but only if a woman could attract a husband capable of supporting a family, no easy task in communities where male unemployment was endemic. For women with children but no husband, the situation became nearly impossible. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act had abolished outdoor relief for able-bodied adults, meaning that single mothers faced a stark choice: enter the workhouse where they would be separated from their children, or find some other means of survival. Many chose prostitution as the lesser of available evils. Sarah Wise, a social investigator who spent years documenting conditions in London's slums, recorded the testimony of Ellen, a 28-year-old mother of 3. "I'd rather die than see my babies in the workhouse. I know what happens there: children dying of diseases, families split apart forever. When my husband died of consumption, I tried to keep us going with washing and mending, but I couldn't earn enough. The rent man don't care if you've got hungry babies. He wants his money every week, same as always." Ellen worked from a basement room in 7 Dials, one of London's most notorious rookeries. She charged 6pence for her services, roughly equivalent to what a skilled craftsman might earn in an hour. On good nights, she might see 3 or 4 clients. On bad nights, none at all. The mathematics of survival in such circumstances left little room for moral luxury. Josephine Butler, a feminist reformer who campaigned against the Contagious Diseases Acts, understood better than most of her contemporaries how poverty created vulnerability to sexual exploitation. Born in 1828 AD to a middle-class family, Butler had resources that allowed her to investigate conditions that other respectable women couldn't or wouldn't examine directly. In her 1869 AD pamphlet, The Constitution Violated, Butler wrote, "We speak of these women as though they were a separate class, fallen beings who chose their fate. But talk to them, as I have, and you discover they are sisters, daughters, mothers, women who found themselves with no choice but the choice between starvation and survival on terms dictated by male desire." Butler's investigations took her into brothels across Britain, where she documented conditions that shocked even her reformist sensibilities. In Liverpool, she visited establishments where girls as young as 13 worked alongside women in their 40s and 50s. In Birmingham, she found brothels operating above legitimate businesses, their existence known to police, magistrates, and city officials, who chose to look the other way as long as operations remained discreet. "The hypocrisy astounds me," Butler confided to her diary after visiting a high-class establishment in Edinburgh in 1871 AD. "Downstairs, respectable gentlemen conduct business over brandy and cigars. Upstairs, young women, some barely more than children, service the sexual appetites of men who would publicly denounce them as fallen creatures. The same men who vote on laws governing public morality by day become customers of vice by night." Butler's observations revealed a crucial aspect of Victorian brothel culture: the elaborate system of denial and double standards that allowed it to flourish. Respectable society maintained its moral authority by treating prostitution as an unfortunate necessity that existed entirely outside the bounds of civilized life. This fiction required constant maintenance, including laws that criminalized the women involved while rarely touching their male customers. Dr. James Miller, a physician who worked in London's East End during the 1870s and 1880s, kept detailed case notes that provide medical perspective on conditions in Victorian brothels. His patient records, preserved in the archives of the Royal London Hospital, document the physical toll of prostitution with clinical precision that's both invaluable and heartbreaking. Patient Agnes M., age 17, admitted March 14, 1882 AD, Miller wrote, "Severe lacerations to genital area, consistent with violent assault. Patient states she works at establishment on Commercial Street, refuses to name perpetrator for fear of losing employment. This marks her fourth admission in 6 months. Malnutrition evident. Patient weighs approximately 6 stone despite average height. Symptoms consistent with consumption in early stages. Miller's notes reveal patterns of violence, disease, and neglect that characterized life in Victorian brothels. Venereal diseases spread rapidly in an era before antibiotics, leaving women with painful, often fatal infections. Violence from customers was common and rarely prosecuted. Malnutrition weakened immune systems already compromised by poor living conditions and constant stress. The women who come to me are not the wicked creatures portrayed in moral tracts, Miller wrote to a colleague in 1884 AD. They are human beings ground down by circumstances beyond their control. I treat their injuries and diseases, but I cannot treat the poverty and desperation that brought them to my surgery in the first place. Miller's medical perspective challenged contemporary beliefs about prostitution as moral failing. His clinical observations suggested that sex work was primarily an economic phenomenon, a form of labor undertaken by women with few alternatives, not a manifestation of inherent wickedness or mental deficiency. Annie Chapman understood the economics of survival better than most social reformers ever would. Born around 1840 AD, she'd been married to a coachman named John Chapman, living a respectable working-class life in Windsor until her husband's death left her with no income and few options. By 1888 AD, she was living in common lodging houses in Spitalfields, earning money through casual prostitution and selling flowers or matches on the street. Annie's weekly routine, reconstructed from lodging house records and witness testimonies, illustrates the precarious nature of casual sex work in Victorian London. She needed 4pence nightly for a bed in a common lodging house, clean accommodation by the standards of the area, with shared cooking facilities and some protection from theft and violence. When she couldn't afford a bed, she slept in doorways or passages, vulnerable to weather, police harassment, and predators. On weekends, when working men had money to spend, Annie could sometimes earn enough to pay for several nights' lodging in advance. During the week, when potential customers were scarce and wages depleted, she might go without shelter for days at a time. The stress of this uncertainty, combined with poor nutrition and exposure to the elements, aged women rapidly in circumstances like Annie's. Timothy Donovan, deputy keeper of Crossingham's lodging house where Annie often stayed, testified at her inquest about her final days. She was a quiet woman, never any trouble, always tried to pay her way, though sometimes she'd be short of the 4pence for her bed. On those nights I'd see her walking toward Hanbury Street, looking for business. She was getting on, not young anymore, and the work was getting harder for her. Annie's situation reflected broader changes in London's casual prostitution market during the 1880s. Economic depression had increased competition among working-class women for both legitimate and illegitimate employment. Younger women commanded higher prices, leaving older prostitutes to work for less money in increasingly dangerous circumstances. The night of September 7, 1888 AD, Annie couldn't raise the 4pence for her lodging. She'd been ill for weeks, suffering from what lodging house residents described as consumption and chronic stomach problems that may have been symptoms of advanced syphilis. Timothy Donovan found her sitting in the kitchen of Crossingham's around 2 a.m., clearly unwell and without money for a bed. "I can't let you stay here without paying," Donovan told her, though witnesses reported he seemed reluctant to turn out a sick woman in the middle of the night. "I'll be back soon," Annie replied, wrapping a thin shawl around her shoulders before walking into the darkness of Dorset Street. She was found murdered 6 hours later in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, her body bearing evidence of the brutal violence that would make her the second confirmed victim of Jack the Ripper. But Annie's death, shocking as it was, represented just one tragic endpoint of circumstances that trapped thousands of Victorian women in cycles of poverty and exploitation. Margaret Harkness, a journalist and social investigator writing under the pseudonym John Law, spent months in 1887 AD living among the women of London's East End to document their experiences firsthand. Her book In Darkest London provides rare contemporary insight into the social structures that sustained prostitution in Victorian Britain. "The public believes these women choose their fate," Harkness wrote, "but choice implies alternatives, and what alternatives exist for a woman with no education, no family support, and no legal rights? The factory pays starvation wages for 14-hour days that destroy health and spirit. Domestic service means sexual vulnerability to male employers with no legal recourse for assault. Marriage to a working-class man offers the security of shared poverty if he lives, and destitution when he dies." Harkness documented the informal networks that connected different levels of sex work in Victorian London. Women working in established brothels sometimes acted as recruiters, approaching desperate women in workhouses, lodging houses, and factory districts. The process wasn't always coercive in obvious ways. Often it was simply a matter of offering solutions to immediate crises. "I met Lily in the workhouse," recalled Emma, a woman Harkness interviewed in 1887 AD. "She'd been there before, knew how awful it was. Families separated, husbands from wives, mothers from children. When I was about to go in with my baby, she told me there was another way. Said she knew a place where I could earn enough to rent a room, keep my daughter with me. I didn't know what kind of work she meant at first, and when I figured it out, it seemed better than losing my child forever." Emma's story illustrates how Victorian society's harsh treatment of unmarried mothers created vulnerabilities that brothel operators could exploit. The workhouse system, designed to discourage dependence on public relief, often forced women into prostitution by making legitimate alternatives unbearably punitive. Harkness also documented the elaborate hierarchy that existed within Victorian brothel culture. At the top were expensive establishments in fashionable districts like St. John's Wood or Regent Street, where well-dressed women entertained wealthy clients in luxurious surroundings. These houses operated with semi-official protection, paying bribes to police and local officials to ensure discretion. Mrs. Jeffries, who operated high-class establishments in Chelsea and Marylebone during the 1870s and 1880s, employed women who could pass for respectable middle-class ladies. Her brothels featured elegant furnishings, excellent food and wine, and entertainment that might include piano music or theatrical performances. Clients paid premium prices for the illusion of seducing virtuous women, rather than purchasing commercial sex. But Mrs. Jeffries' establishments, while luxurious compared to street prostitution, still operated on fundamentally exploitative principles. Women working in high-class brothels typically owed substantial debts to madams for clothing, room, board, and medical care. These debts, calculated at inflated rates, could take years to repay while accruing interest that kept women in permanent bondage. Police records from 1885 AD show that Mrs. Jeffries' operation came under official scrutiny only when it began attracting attention from moral reform societies. Inspector Frederick Aberline, who would later investigate the Jack the Ripper murders, led raids on several of her properties, but found little evidence of obvious criminality. The women appeared well-dressed and healthy, claimed to be there voluntarily, and refused to testify against their employer. "The difficulty," Aberline wrote in his official report, "lies in distinguishing between voluntary and involuntary participation. When the alternatives facing these women are so limited, they may choose to remain in these establishments, but their choices are constrained by circumstances that leave them few options for legitimate employment at comparable income levels." Aberline's analysis touched on fundamental questions about consent and coercion in Victorian prostitution. Even in relatively comfortable establishments like Mrs. Jeffries, women's apparent cooperation might reflect calculated assessment of available alternatives rather than genuine freedom of choice. Alice Mitchell, who worked in a mid-tier brothel in Pimlico during the 1880s, left one of the few first-hand accounts of daily life in such establishments. Her diary, discovered among her effects after her death in 1894 AD, provides intimate details of the psychological strategies women used to cope with their circumstances. "Rose new girl today," Alice wrote on October 12, 1883 AD. "Hardly more than a child, maybe 16 at most. Says her family died of fever, been on streets for weeks. Mrs. Henderson took her in, gave her a bath and proper dress. Girl thinks she's been saved, doesn't understand yet what's expected. I remember feeling grateful too at first. Seems like rescue when you're hungry and desperate." Alice's observations reveal how brothel operators recruited vulnerable women through apparent acts of charity. New arrivals often experienced their first weeks as salvation from immediate crises, making it psychologically difficult to recognize exploitation when it became apparent. "We tell ourselves stories to make it bearable," Alice continued in a later entry, "that we're actresses playing roles, that the men who visit us are kind gentlemen who appreciate our company. Some girls convince themselves they're saving money to start legitimate businesses or find respectable husbands. I used to dream of opening a little shop selling ribbons and lace to ladies. Now I know better, but the dreams helped for a while." Alice's diary documents the gradual erosion of hope and self-deception that characterized long-term sex work in Victorian brothels. Women developed elaborate mental defenses against the reality of their situations, but these defenses became harder to maintain as years passed and escape remained elusive. The entry for March 3, 1885 AD shows Alice grappling with the arrival of increasingly young women at her establishment. Mrs. Henderson brought in 2 girls today who look barely 14, says their sisters, parents dead, been begging on streets, fed them hot soup and let them sleep in real beds for first time in months. They're so grateful they'd probably do anything she asked. Makes me sick to watch, remembering how it felt to be rescued. Want to warn them, but what good would it do? Where else would they go? Alice's moral distress reflected growing concern among some Victorian prostitutes about the recruitment of very young women into sex work. While the age of consent had been raised from 12 to 13 in 1875 AD and would be raised again to 16 in 1885 AD, when T. Stead, editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, shocked Victorian society in 1885 AD with his investigative series The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, which exposed the trafficking of young girls into London brothels. Stead's dramatic journalism, while sometimes sensationalized, documented genuine cases of children being sold into prostitution by desperate parents or kidnapped from poor neighborhoods. "I have purchased the persons of these children," Stead wrote, describing his investigation, "not for my own base purposes, but to demonstrate how easily such transactions can be accomplished in Christian England. The corruption of youth proceeds with mechanical regularity, protected by the silence of those who should be guardians of public morality." Stead's exposé led to the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 AD, which raised the age of consent and criminalized procurement of young women for prostitution. But legal changes had limited impact on the underlying conditions that made children vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Poverty, family breakdown, and lack of social support systems continued to push young people toward dangerous forms of survival. Rebecca Jarrett, a former prostitute turned moral reformer who assisted Stead's investigation, provided detailed testimony about methods used to recruit young women into Victorian brothels. Born around 1846 AD, Rebecca had worked in prostitution for nearly 20 years before experiencing religious conversion and dedicating her life to rescue work. "They target girls at their most vulnerable moments," Rebecca testified to a parliamentary commission in 1886 AD, "when they're newly orphaned or thrown out of employment or running from violent homes. Offer them food, shelter, pretty clothes, things they've never had. By the time they understand what's expected in return, they're already trapped by debt and dependency." Rebecca's testimony revealed sophisticated recruitment networks that operated across Britain and continental Europe. Young women might be approached in one city, transported to another where they had no local connections, and established in brothels where isolation made escape nearly impossible. "In Liverpool, I knew women who worked specifically as recruiters," Rebecca continued. "They'd watch the ships from Ireland, looking for young women traveling alone, offer to help them find employment in London or Manchester. These girls trusted them because they were women, seemed respectable, spoke kindly. They had no way of knowing these helpful ladies earned commission for every girl they delivered to certain establishments." The international dimension of Victorian prostitution extended beyond recruitment, to include organized trafficking routes that moved women between countries. Police records from the 1880s document cases of English women found working in Brussels, French women in London establishments, and German women in Liverpool brothels, suggesting coordinated networks that transcended national boundaries. Inspector Edmund Reed, who supervised policing in London's East End during the 1880s, kept detailed notes on the international aspects of prostitution in his district. His observations, preserved in Metropolitan Police archives, provide insight into the global dimensions of Victorian sex trafficking. "We regularly encounter foreign women in local establishments," Reed wrote in 1887 AD. "Many speak little English, cannot explain how they arrived in London, and appear terrified of returning to their countries of origin. Some claim to have been promised legitimate employment as domestic servants or factory workers, only to find themselves in circumstances they had not anticipated and cannot escape." Reed's notes document specific cases that illustrate trafficking patterns. Marie, a 17-year-old from Belgium, claimed she'd been offered work as a housemaid in a wealthy London family. Instead, she found herself in a Whitechapel brothel, where she was told she owed money for transportation, food, and accommodation that must be repaid through sex work. When questioned about returning to Belgium, Reed wrote, Marie became extremely agitated and claimed her family believed she was working respectably in England. She feared that returning home would bring disgrace on her siblings and prevent their making advantageous marriages. This shame effectively trapped her in circumstances she desperately wished to escape. Marie's psychological entrapment through shame and family honor represented another layer of control used by Victorian brothel operators. Women who might physically escape their circumstances often remained trapped by social expectations that made return to their former lives impossible once they had worked in prostitution. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, one of the first women licensed to practice medicine in Britain, documented the medical consequences of prostitution in Victorian establishments with clinical precision that male physicians often avoided. Her 1881 AD report, The Human Element in Sex, provided rare female medical perspective on conditions that affected thousands of women. The physical deterioration proceeds with predictable regularity, Dr. Blackwell wrote. Venereal diseases spread rapidly in environments where multiple partners are the norm and preventive measures primitive, but the psychological damage often proves more devastating than physical ailments. I have treated women who survived syphilis and gonorrhea but never recovered from the trauma of sustained sexual violence disguised as commerce. Dr. Blackwell's medical records document the progression of sexually transmitted diseases in an era before effective treatments. Primary syphilis might be manageable, but secondary and tertiary stages caused permanent damage to cardiovascular and nervous systems. Women working in prostitution often died in their 20s and 30s from diseases that would have been survivable with proper medical care. The establishments vary greatly in their attention to medical care, Dr. Blackwell noted. High-class houses sometimes employ physicians to examine women regularly and treat diseases promptly. Lower-tier operations provide no medical attention whatever, allowing infections to progress unchecked until women become too ill to work. These women are then typically expelled from the premises to die in workhouse infirmaries or on the streets. Dr. Blackwell also documented the use of primitive contraceptive and abortifacient methods in Victorian brothels. Women attempted to prevent pregnancy through douching with various substances, insertion of objects intended to block conception, and consumption of herbs and chemicals believed to terminate pregnancies. These methods were often ineffective and sometimes dangerous, causing infections, poisoning, or internal injuries. I have treated numerous cases of mercury poisoning from patent medicines advertised as remedies for female complaints, Dr. Blackwell wrote in 1883 AD. These preparations, widely available despite their toxic effects, are used by women desperate to control reproduction in circumstances where pregnancy would mean loss of income and potential abandonment by employers. The intersection of reproductive health and economic survival created additional vulnerabilities for women in Victorian prostitution. Pregnancy typically meant temporary or permanent loss of employment, with few resources available for supporting children born under such circumstances. Louisa Twenning, a philanthropist who established refuge homes for women leaving prostitution, documented the challenges facing women who attempted to escape sex work. Her organization, founded in 1858 AD, provided temporary shelter and basic job training for women seeking legitimate employment. The difficulties they face are enormous, Twining wrote in her 1879 AD annual report. Respectable employers will not hire women with histories of prostitution, regardless of their current circumstances or desires for reform. Many possess no skills beyond those learned in their former trade. Most heartbreaking of all, they often cannot return to their families, who view them as permanently disgraced. Twining's refuge house records provide insight into the long-term consequences of involvement in Victorian prostitution. Women who successfully left sex work often remained permanently marginalized, able to find only the lowest paid and most precarious forms of employment. Many returned to prostitution, not from choice but from inability to survive on wages available to them in legitimate work. Sarah came to us in 1877, Twining recorded, determined to reform her life and find respectable employment. She was intelligent, well-spoken, and possessed genuine skills in needlework, but after months of searching, no household would employ her as a seamstress once they learned of her history. She left our refuge eventually, saying she couldn't survive on the pittance earned doing washing for charitable organizations. We never saw her again. Sarah's story illustrates how Victorian moral attitudes created permanent barriers to reform, even for women genuinely committed to leaving prostitution. The social stigma attached to sex work extended beyond the women themselves to their families and anyone associated with them, creating powerful incentives for continued concealment and isolation. The children of women working in Victorian prostitution faced particularly tragic circumstances. Some brothels prohibited women from keeping children on the premises, forcing mothers to choose between abandoning their children or losing their only source of income. Others allowed children to remain but exposed them to environments that were psychologically damaging and often physically dangerous. Frances Power Cobb, a feminist writer who investigated conditions affecting women and children in Victorian society, documented cases of children growing up in brothel environments. Her 1884 AD pamphlet, The Little Slaves of England, included testimonies from children who had lived in such establishments. Tommy, age 8, has lived his entire life in the house where his mother works, Cobby wrote. He cannot read or write, has never attended school, and possesses no understanding of life beyond these rooms. During business hours, he hides in the cellar or attic, emerging only when clients have departed. His mother loves him deeply but sees no way to provide him with a different life while earning enough to feed and house them both. Children in these circumstances often developed premature awareness of adult sexuality, while remaining ignorant of basic social and educational skills needed for legitimate employment. Boys might eventually become procurers or brothel operators themselves, while girls frequently entered prostitution as their only known means of survival. The generational cycle of involvement in sex work represented one of the most tragic aspects of Victorian prostitution. Women working in brothels often lacked resources to provide their children with alternatives, while society offered few support systems for families existing outside conventional moral boundaries. Police Constable George Godley, who patrolled Whitechapel during the 1880s, kept unofficial notes on the women he encountered during his rounds. His observations, preserved in his personal papers, provide ground-level perspective on the daily realities of street prostitution in Victorian London. "Most of the women I know by name and circumstance," Godley wrote in 1888 AD, "they're not criminals in any ordinary sense, just poor souls trying to survive in circumstances that would challenge anyone. I arrest them when required by law, but it solves nothing. They pay their fines and return to the streets the same night because they have no alternatives." Godley's notes reveal the futility of legal approaches to Victorian prostitution that criminalized the women involved while ignoring the social and economic conditions that created their circumstances. Arrests and fines became simply another cost of doing business, absorbed into the already precarious economics of survival sex work. "Elizabeth Stride pays me no trouble," Godley observed. "Always polite, never violent or disorderly. But I've watched her health decline over the past year. She's developing the hollow look they all get eventually. Coughs constantly, too thin, but still walks the streets every night because she needs the money for lodging. I know her story isn't unusual, but seeing it happen gradual-like makes it harder somehow." Godley's personal connection to Elizabeth Stride, who would become another victim of Jack the Ripper in September 1888 AD, illustrates how individual police officers often developed sympathetic understanding of women they were officially required to treat as criminals. This created internal conflicts between professional duty and human compassion that characterized law enforcement's relationship with prostitution throughout the Victorian era. The night of September 30th, 1888 AD, brought particular tragedy to London's East End, when two women, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, were murdered within an hour of each other, both killed while engaged in survival sex work that had become their only means of avoiding destitution. Their deaths crystallized public attention on conditions that had existed for decades but remained largely invisible to respectable society. Elizabeth had been born in Sweden in 1843 AD, immigrating to London where she worked as a domestic servant before circumstances led her to occasional prostitution. Catherine, as we've seen, had worked as a tin plate stamper before economic hardship drove her to similar expedients. Both women were past their prime by sex work standards, competing for customers with younger women in an oversaturated market. Their murders shocked Victorian society not because such violence was unusual. Women in their circumstances faced danger constantly, but because the theatrical brutality of their deaths forced public acknowledgement of lives that polite society preferred to ignore. Newspaper coverage of the Jack the Ripper murders provided graphic details of the victims' final hours, while maintaining moral distance through language that emphasized their deviation from respectable femininity. The Times of London, reporting on Elizabeth Stride's death, noted, "The deceased was a woman of dissolute character who frequented the common lodging houses of the district." This language, typical of contemporary reporting, served to maintain boundaries between worthy and unworthy victims, while avoiding examination of the social conditions that had led to their circumstances. But some observers recognized the broader implications of the murders. George Bernard Shaw, writing in the Star newspaper in September 1888 AD, challenged his readers to consider the social context. The Whitechapel murders are not the work of a monster, but the inevitable result of a social system that creates monsters by denying basic dignity and security to the most vulnerable members of society. Shaw's analysis, radical for its time, suggested that the violence against prostitutes represented an extreme manifestation of broader social violence against women trapped in poverty. This perspective challenged comfortable assumptions about individual moral responsibility by examining structural conditions that created vulnerability to exploitation and harm. The Whitechapel murders also revealed the extent to which police and local authorities had developed informal accommodation with prostitution in working-class districts. Officers like George Godley knew the women on their beats by name, understood their circumstances, and generally intervened only when required to maintain public order or investigate serious crimes. This unofficial tolerance reflected practical recognition that criminalization of prostitution was largely unenforceable, given the social and economic conditions that sustained it. Women would continue selling sex as long as they had no alternatives for survival, regardless of legal penalties. Law enforcement resources were better devoted to maintaining basic public safety than attempting to eliminate behaviors that stemmed from circumstances beyond individual control. Dr. Thomas Bond, police surgeon who examined the bodies of Jack the Ripper's victims, provided clinical documentation of the violence that characterized the dangerous end of Victorian sex work. His post-mortem reports, while focused on cause of death, revealed broader patterns of injury and disease that affected women working in prostitution. The deceased showed evidence of chronic malnutrition, Dr. Bond wrote, regarding Catherine Eddowes. Dental decay consistent with poor diet and lack of medical care. Scarring on hands and arms suggests previous violent encounters. Overall physical condition indicates prolonged exposure to harsh living conditions and inadequate nutrition. Dr. Bond's medical examinations revealed that the spectacular violence of the Ripper murders represented only the most extreme end of a spectrum of harm that women in prostitution faced regularly. Malnutrition, disease, exposure to weather, and violence from customers created cumulative damage that shortened lives, even when individual incidents weren't immediately fatal. The autumn of 1888 AD marked a turning point in public awareness of conditions affecting women in Victorian prostitution. The murder investigations brought unprecedented attention to districts like Whitechapel, where journalists and social investigators documented living conditions that shocked middle-class readers. Arthur Morrison, a journalist who spent months investigating conditions in London's East End, published his findings in Tales of Mean Streets. His descriptions of Whitechapel revealed a world that existed parallel to respectable Victorian society, but remained largely hidden from public view. The streets are narrow and crooked, Morrison wrote, lined with houses that seem to lean against each other for support. In the doorways and passages, women wait for customers who may never come. They range in age from girls who should be in school to grandmothers old enough to remember better times. What unites them is not wickedness, but the simple mathematics of survival in a society that offers them no alternatives. Morrison's journalism captured the grinding poverty that sustained prostitution in Victorian London, while challenging readers to consider their own complicity in systems that created such desperation. His work contributed to growing awareness that sexual exploitation couldn't be understood as individual moral failing, but required examination of broader social and economic structures. The investigations following the Whitechapel murders also revealed the extent to which local businesses and institutions had developed symbiotic relationships with prostitution. Public houses served as informal meeting places where women could encounter potential customers. Lodging houses provided shelter that made survival possible between periods of work. Medical practitioners, chemists, and even clergymen developed informal roles in supporting women who existed outside conventional social structures. John McCarthy, who owned several properties in Miller's Court where Mary Kelly lived, exemplified the complex relationships between legitimate business and prostitution in Victorian working-class districts. McCarthy collected rents from women he knew worked as prostitutes, extending credit when necessary, and providing basic security that made their survival possible. "I don't ask questions about how my tenants earn their money," McCarthy testified at Mary Kelly's inquest. "My business is providing clean, safe accommodation at prices working people can afford. If I refused to rent to women of questionable reputation, half my properties would stand empty. The ladies pay their rent regular, keep their rooms clean, and cause less trouble than some of my male tenants who drink too much." McCarthy's testimony illustrated how Victorian prostitution was embedded within networks of legitimate commerce that depended on income from sex work, while maintaining public distance from its moral implications. This economic interdependence made campaigns to eliminate prostitution practically impossible, regardless of moral objections. The relationship between alcohol and prostitution in Victorian society created additional layers of exploitation and vulnerability. Public houses served as crucial social spaces for working-class communities, but they also functioned as recruitment centers where desperate women could be identified and approached by procurers or brothel operators. Gin palaces, which proliferated in poor districts during the mid-19th century, offered temporary escape from harsh living conditions through cheap alcohol and gaudy entertainment, but they also created environments where intoxicated women became vulnerable to sexual exploitation and recruitment into prostitution. Martha Tabram, murdered in George Yard Buildings on August 7, 1888 AD, exemplified the connections between alcohol, poverty, and vulnerability to violence that characterized many women's lives in Victorian London's working-class districts. Born around 1849 AD, Martha had been married to a furniture packer named Henry Tabram before separation left her dependent on casual employment and occasional prostitution. On the night of her death, witnesses saw Martha drinking with soldiers in several public houses around Whitechapel. Her decision to accompany one of these men to a secluded location reflected the calculated risks that women in her circumstances took regularly, balancing immediate financial need against personal safety in situations where neither could be guaranteed. Martha's murder, which preceded the canonical Jack the Ripper killings, received relatively little attention from press or police. Her death was treated as a regrettable but unremarkable consequence of the dangerous lifestyle she had chosen, rather than as evidence of systematic violence against vulnerable women. This differential treatment reflected broader Victorian attitudes toward violence against women in prostitution. Deaths that occurred during sex work were often dismissed as occupational hazards rather than crimes deserving serious investigation. Women who sold sex were considered to have forfeited claims to protection and sympathy that society extended to respectable victims. The contrast became apparent in press coverage of the canonical Ripper murders, which received intense attention, partly because their spectacular brutality transcended normal boundaries of violence against prostitutes. The theatrical mutilation of the victims forced public acknowledgement that these were human beings who had suffered extraordinary violence, not simply casualties of their chosen profession. Annie Millward, who survived a knife attack in February 1888, provided rare first-hand testimony about violence against women working in prostitution. Her statement to police, given while recovering from wounds that nearly killed her, described an attack that would have been typical, except for her survival to report it. "He seemed like a gentleman at first," Annie told Inspector Reed. "Well-dressed, polite manner of speaking, said he had a room nearby where we could conduct our business privately. I should have known better. The real gentlemen don't pick up women on Commercial Street. But I needed the money for lodging, and he was offering good coin." Annie's testimony revealed patterns of behavior that may have characterized attacks on other women who didn't survive to report them. Assailants who targeted prostitutes often used their apparent respectability to gain trust before revealing violent intentions. Women working in dangerous circumstances had to make rapid assessments of potential customers based on limited information, with fatal consequences when they guessed wrong. "Once we were alone, his whole manner changed," Annie continued. "Started talking about cleansing the streets of filth like me, said he was doing God's work. I tried to run, but he had a knife, came at me like a madman. If that constable hadn't heard me screaming, I'd be dead like the others." Annie's description of her attacker's language, references to cleansing and divine mission, suggested that violence against prostitutes was often motivated by moral ideology rather than simple criminal intent. Men who attacked women in prostitution frequently justified their actions through religious or social reform rhetoric that portrayed violence as purification rather than crime. This ideological dimension of violence against prostitutes reflected broader Victorian anxieties about sexuality, morality, and social order. Women who sold sex became symbolic targets for men who felt threatened by changing social conditions or their own inability to conform to masculine ideals of respectability and success. The testimony of survivors like Annie Millward provided crucial insight into patterns of violence that remained largely invisible because so few victims lived to report their experiences. Her survival was unusual enough that police initially doubted her account, assuming that attacks on prostitutes typically resulted in death or were fabricated to gain sympathy. Frances Coles, who survived until April 1891 AD before being murdered under circumstances that may have been connected to the Ripper killings, exemplified the prolonged vulnerability that characterized women's experiences in Victorian prostitution. Born around 1865 AD, Frances had worked in various forms of casual employment before economic circumstances led her to occasional sex work. Police records document Frances' repeated encounters with violence during the years before her death. She was treated for injuries on at least 6 occasions between 1888 and 1891 AD, usually claiming she had fallen or been injured in accidents rather than admitting to assaults that might reflect poorly on her reputation or endanger her attackers. Frances was afraid to name the men who hurt her, testified Ellen, a woman who knew Frances from the lodging houses, said it would only make things worse if she caused trouble for customers. Better to take the beating and hope for gentler treatment next time. We all understood that reasoning. Complaining about violence just made you seem like trouble, and troublesome women don't get customers. Ellen's testimony revealed how economic dependence on potentially violent customers created powerful incentives for women to accept abuse rather than report it. Complaining about violence could result in loss of income that meant the difference between shelter and homelessness, making silent endurance seem like the rational choice even when injuries were severe. The night of February 13, 1891 AD, Frances was found murdered beneath a railway arch in Swallow Gardens, her throat cut in circumstances that bore similarities to earlier Ripper killings. But by 1891 AD, public attention had moved on from the Whitechapel murders, and Frances's death received minimal press coverage despite evidence suggesting it might have been connected to the earlier crimes. The declining public interest in violence against East End prostitutes after 1889 AD illustrated how quickly Victorian society returned to its normal pattern of ignoring conditions that briefly shocked them into awareness. The Ripper murders had created temporary disruption in the usual invisibility of women working in prostitution, but this attention proved unsustainable once the spectacular violence ended. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, who conducted post-mortem examinations on several of the Ripper victims, documented medical evidence that revealed the chronic health problems affecting women in Victorian prostitution. His detailed reports, while focused on immediate causes of death, provided broader insight into the physical toll of lives lived in extreme poverty and dangerous circumstances. The deceased Catherine Eddowes showed extensive evidence of chronic kidney disease. Dr. Brown wrote in his official report dated October 1st, liver damage consistent with prolonged alcohol consumption, scarring on hands and forearms suggesting defensive wounds from previous attacks. Overall physical condition indicates prolonged malnutrition and exposure to harsh living conditions. Dr. Brown's clinical observations revealed that the women murdered by Jack the Ripper were already dying slowly from the accumulated effects of poverty, malnutrition, disease, and violence. The spectacular nature of their final moments obscured the ongoing process of physical deterioration that characterized their daily existence. Mary Ann Nichols displayed symptoms of advanced syphilis, Dr. Brown noted in another report, tooth loss from poor nutrition and lack of dental care, chronic respiratory infection, possibly tuberculosis in early stages. These women are dying by degrees long before they encounter violent death. The medical evidence documented in post-mortem reports provided objective confirmation of conditions that social investigators had observed, but that respectable society preferred to ignore. Women working in Victorian prostitution faced a range of health challenges that would have been treatable with proper medical care and adequate nutrition, but became fatal when combined with poverty and social isolation. Ellen Holland, the last person known to have spoken with Mary Ann Nichols before her murder, provided testimony that revealed the daily struggle for survival that characterized life for women in her circumstances. Ellen had known Mary Ann at Wilmot's lodging house, where both women stayed when they could afford the 4p nightly fee. She was drunk when I saw her that night, Ellen testified at the inquest. Said she'd had her lodging money 3 times that day but spent it on gin instead of paying for a bed. I told her to come back with me to Wilmot's. Said I'd try to convince them to let her stay without paying, but she laughed and said she'd soon get her DOS money, pointed to her bonnet and said it was new, and she'd have no trouble finding a customer. Ellen's testimony revealed the immediate economic calculations that govern daily survival for women in Mary Ann's circumstances. The choice between spending money on alcohol for temporary relief from harsh conditions or saving it for shelter reflected the impossible trade-offs that desperate poverty imposed on women with few resources and fewer options. I should have insisted she come with me, Ellen continued. Should have paid her lodging myself, though I could barely afford my own. But you get tired of trying to save people who don't seem to want saving. Mary Ann had been drinking too much for months, taking more risks, not looking after herself proper. We all saw it happening, but what could we do? Ellen's sense of guilt and helplessness reflected the psychological toll on women who watched friends and acquaintances deteriorate under conditions they couldn't escape themselves. The solidarity that developed among women in similar circumstances was complicated by competition for scarce resources and the knowledge that anyone might be the next victim of violence or disease. Mary Ann's final hours, reconstructed from witness testimony and police investigation, illustrated the random nature of violence that made every encounter potentially fatal for women working in street prostitution. Her decision to reject Ellen's offer of help and continue searching for customers reflected not recklessness but rational assessment of her immediate options, given the resources available to her. The night of August 31st, 1888 AD, Mary Ann needed 4p for lodging and had no legitimate means of earning it before the lodging houses stopped admitting residents for the night. Her choice to continue working despite intoxication and obvious vulnerability represented the kind of calculated risk that women in her circumstances took regularly, because the alternative sleeping rough carried different but equally serious dangers. Charles Cross, the carman who discovered Mary Ann's body in Bucks Row, testified that he initially mistook her for a drunk woman sleeping in the street. His assumption reflected how common it was to encounter intoxicated or ill women in the public spaces of working-class districts, making violent death difficult to distinguish from other forms of urban misery until examined closely. "I thought she was just another poor soul who'd had too much drink," Cross testified. "You see them all the time in these streets, women who've nowhere else to go, sleeping wherever they can find shelter. It wasn't until I got closer that I realized something was wrong. The way she was lying, the blood, I knew then she wasn't just drunk." Cross's testimony revealed how violence against women in Victorian working-class districts was normalized to the extent that murder victims could be mistaken for routine casualties of poverty and social neglect. The conditions that made women vulnerable to fatal violence were so common that death itself became unremarkable, until it took particularly dramatic forms. Robert Paul, another carman who encountered Mary Ann's body shortly after Cross, initially refused to approach what he assumed was simply another drunk woman. His reluctance reflected working-class men's learned avoidance of involvement with women who appeared to be prostitutes, understanding that association with such women could damage their own reputations and employment prospects. "Cross called me over, said something was wrong with the woman," Paul testified. "I didn't want to get involved at first. You learn to mind your own business in these parts, especially when it comes to women of that sort. But Cross seemed genuinely concerned, so I took a look. Wish I hadn't, to be honest. Some sights stay with you." Paul's testimony illustrated how social stigma attached to prostitution created barriers to assistance, even in life-threatening situations. Men who might have helped women in distress hesitated when those women appeared to be engaged in sex work, understanding that involvement could compromise their own social standing. The discovery of Mary Ann's body marked the beginning of public awareness of conditions that had existed in London's working-class districts for decades, but remained largely invisible to respectable society. Her death became significant, not because violence against prostitutes was unusual, but because the circumstances of her murder eventually forced acknowledgement of lives that polite Victorian society preferred to ignore. Inspector John Spratling, who supervised the initial investigation of Mary Ann's murder, documented police procedures that revealed law enforcement's routine handling of violence against women in prostitution. His reports, preserved in Metropolitan Police files, provide insight into official attitudes toward crimes involving victims from marginalized communities. "The deceased was a woman of dissolute character," Spratling wrote in his initial report dated September 1st, when it was towed. "Frequent inhabitant of common lodging houses in the Whitechapel district. No known relatives or persons of respectability to notify regarding her death. Investigation proceeding according to standard procedures for cases involving persons of her class." Spratling's language reflected institutional assumptions about the relative value of different victims' lives. Women working in prostitution were categorized as inherently less worthy of intensive investigation than respectable victims, with police resources allocated accordingly. But the escalating pattern of murders in Whitechapel during autumn 1888 AD eventually forced more serious attention to crimes that might otherwise have been dismissed as unfortunate but predictable consequences of immoral lifestyle choices. The theatrical brutality of the killings transcended normal boundaries of violence against prostitutes and demanded responses that acknowledged these women as human beings deserving protection. Inspector Frederick Aberline, assigned to coordinate the Ripper investigation, brought more sympathetic perspective to cases involving prostitute victims. His experience policing working-class districts had given him understanding of the social and economic conditions that created vulnerability to exploitation and violence. "These women are not criminals in any meaningful sense," Aberline wrote in a confidential report to his superiors in October 1888 AD. "They are casualties of social conditions that leave them few alternatives for survival. Our investigation must recognize that they deserve the same protection and consideration we would extend to any other victims of violent crime." Aberline's perspective represented minority opinion within Victorian law enforcement, but his approach to the Ripper investigation established precedents for treating crimes against prostitutes as serious matters deserving professional attention rather than routine incidents of predictable violence. The autumn of 1888 AD also witnessed unprecedented cooperation between police and social reform organizations investigating conditions in London's East End. Groups like the London City Mission and the Salvation Army had maintained informal relationships with women working in prostitution for years, providing services that complemented law enforcement's official responsibilities. William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army, had documented conditions affecting women in Victorian prostitution through his organization's rescue work. His 1890 AD book, In Darkest England and the Way Out, provided detailed analysis of the social and economic factors that sustained sexual exploitation, while proposing practical reforms that addressed underlying causes rather than simply criminalizing symptoms. The women we encounter in our rescue work are not the depraved creatures portrayed in moral literature, Booth wrote. They are human beings trapped by circumstances beyond their individual control: poverty, family breakdown, lack of education, absence of legitimate employment opportunities. Any meaningful response to prostitution must address these underlying conditions, rather than simply punishing the women involved. Booth's analysis challenged contemporary assumptions about prostitution as individual moral failing by examining structural conditions that created vulnerability to sexual exploitation. His organization's practical work with women leaving prostitution provided evidence that reform was possible when supported by adequate resources and social acceptance. The Salvation Army's records from the 1880s document hundreds of cases of women who successfully transitioned from prostitution to legitimate employment when provided with training, temporary support, and protection from social stigma. These success stories demonstrated that involvement in sex work need not be permanent when alternatives became available. Sarah came to us in 1887, recorded Major Emma Booth, William Booth's daughter who supervised women's rescue work. She had been working in a Whitechapel brothel for 3 years after her husband's death left her with 2 young children and no means of support. Through our training program, she learned skills in laundry work and eventually established her own small business. She now employs 2 other women and supports her family respectably. Sarah's story illustrated the potential for positive outcomes when women received practical assistance rather than moral condemnation. But such success stories remained exceptional because Victorian society provided few resources for supporting women's transitions away from prostitution or maintaining powerful social barriers that prevented their reintegration into respectable communities. The work of organizations like the Salvation Army also revealed the international dimensions of Victorian prostitution, including trafficking networks that moved women between countries and the global economic forces that created similar conditions of exploitation across different societies. Catherine Bramwell Booth, who supervised rescue work in continental Europe, documented cases of English women found in European brothels and foreign women discovered in British establishments. Her reports, preserved in Salvation Army archives, provide evidence of organized trafficking that connected local exploitation to international criminal networks. In Brussels, we discovered 3 English women working in establishments that catered specifically to British travelers, Bramwell Booth wrote in 1889 AD. They claimed to have been recruited in London with promises of legitimate employment as domestic servants. Once transported to Belgium, they found themselves in circumstances they could not escape due to language barriers, isolation from potential sources of help, and debts to their employers that increased faster than they could be repaid. The international trafficking documented by Bramwell Booth and other investigators revealed sophisticated criminal organizations that exploited legal and practical barriers to women's movement between countries. Women transported across national boundaries became particularly vulnerable because they lost access to whatever limited legal protections might have been available in their home countries. The traffickers understand exactly how to exploit women's vulnerabilities, Bramwell Booth continued. They target those who are desperate, recently widowed, unemployed, estranged from families, offer solutions to immediate crises in exchange for agreements that seem reasonable but become impossible to fulfill. By the time women understand their true circumstances, they are hundreds of miles from home with no resources for escape. These trafficking patterns persisted throughout the Victorian era and beyond, because they served economic interests that transcended individual criminal enterprises. The demand for commercial sex in major cities created markets that criminal organizations could serve profitably, while legal and social barriers prevented effective intervention on behalf of the women involved. As our journey through the hidden chambers and shadowed streets of Victorian prostitution draws toward its close, we must confront a final, uncomfortable truth. The system we've explored never truly ended. It merely transformed, adapted, evolved into forms that modern society finds easier to ignore. Today, in cities across the world, women still trade sex for survival, while respectable society maintains its comfortable fiction that such transactions represent individual choice rather than systemic failure. The gaslit streets of Whitechapel have given way to internet advertisements and massage parlors, but the fundamental mathematics of desperation remain unchanged. Poverty still creates vulnerability. Social marginalization still prevents escape. Violence still claims victims whose deaths merit little attention from authorities or media. The women we've encountered in these pages, Mary Kelly, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, Elizabeth Stride, and countless others whose names were never recorded, continue to walk among us in different clothes, speaking different languages, but facing remarkably similar circumstances. Their stories echo in modern trafficking networks, in the economic calculations of women choosing between different forms of exploitation, in the violence that remains an occupational hazard for those who sell sex in societies that criminalize their survival strategies while ignoring the conditions that make such strategies necessary. Victorian society's elaborate performance of moral outrage, while simultaneously sustaining the system it claimed to deplore, finds perfect modern expression in legislative approaches that criminalize prostitution, while doing nothing to address the poverty, inequality, and lack of alternatives that create circumstances where selling sex becomes rational choice for women with limited options. The real horror of Victorian brothels wasn't simply the individual suffering they contained, though that suffering was immense and genuine. The true horror lay in how thoroughly the system functioned as intended, channeling the sexual desires of respectable men toward women who could be used and discarded without challenging the moral authority of the society that created and sustained their exploitation. Walk through any major city today, and you'll find the descendants of those Victorian establishments, massage parlors with neon signs, escort services advertising in weekly newspapers, internet platforms connecting buyers and sellers of commercial sex. The technologies have evolved, but the fundamental relationships remain unchanged. Desperation on one side, desire on the other, with profit and exploitation bridging the gap between them. Picture yourself once more on that fog-shrouded evening in Whitechapel, 1888 AD. But this time, as you listen to the sounds echoing from those shadowed doorways, the hushed negotiations, the creaking stairs, the muffled cries, remember that these sounds haven't truly stopped. They've simply moved to places where respectable society need not hear them, hidden behind different facades, but sustained by the same ancient economics of survival that drove Mary Kelly to Miller's Court on that final November night when she opened her door to the darkness waiting outside.